I was going to discuss two issues which I felt were extensively passed over, to use a euphemism, in what, for shorthand, I'll call post-colonial studies, post-colonial Middle Eastern studies. One of which I will deal with in full, namely the issue of honor-shame cultures, honor-shame dynamics. The other, which I won't deal with because it's another talk, was going to be about apocalyptic millennialism, which is one of my long-term topics. And both of them share a common phenomenon, which is that if you try and talk to scholars who are not interested in these matters about them, they will say things like, oh, but that's not relevant to my period, my field, whatever it happens to be. In fact, it barely exists in the documentation. If you then take that person and take a look at the documentation and start explaining to him the degree to which this reflects this stuff, his response will just as often as not be, oh, but that's as common as lice, and therefore not worth looking at either. So it's either all over the place or it's nowhere, but whatever it is, I don't want to talk about it. And yet, so let me just briefly tell you what I mean by honor-shame, and further on in my discussion, you'll get more details, but basically, an honor-shame culture is a culture in which the prime concern of every individual, or individual may be an inappropriate term to use, every member of the culture, the primacy of what the honor cohort, that is, the people who count, think about you in terms of either honor or shame. And that honor group tends to create a very powerful in-group mentality in which us-them relations are riddled with hostility and suspicion. And by and large, the solidarity of the group is key to the survival of the group. So another term that could be used for this, if you will, is a tribal mentality. There's a very good book by Mark Wiener called The Rule of the Clan, which I recommend to all of you. Now, the thing about honor-shame culture is that basically, if we date the emergence of Homo sapiens back 150,000 years, which is a sort of grosso modo figure, but still quite recent when we think of evolutionary time, Homo sapiens and language 100 to 150,000 years ago, for that 150,000 years, up until really the last 3 centuries, virtually every society that we could possibly look at or study is dominated by honor-shame dynamics. It is part of the evolutionary hardwiring of human culture that matters of honor and shame matter. And they matter even in our culture, although I'll argue there's been a tendency to dismiss that role or to attempt to banish that role, which itself may be mistaken. But in any case, honor-shame is the dominant form of socialization, of individual and group psychology, of the shaping of public behavior, what you might call the two sides of the coin of honor-shame is the love of honor and the fear of shame or public disgrace. A friend of mine who works on this stuff refers to it as limbic captivity. In other words, you are captive of these really primitive drives in your brain to get honor and to avoid disgrace at all costs. And these attitudes have governed human behavior for, I figured it out, if we take the last 300 years as the period in which a majoritarian culture has adopted non-honor shame driven values, 99.98% of human history is governed by honor shame dynamics. And with it comes the attitudes that have governed what the School of Anal might call the mentalité de longue durée. 150,000-year-long mentalité is pretty hefty thing to deal with. And in that, we have the tribal us-them mentality, self-help justice, revenge, manhood through killing, honor from controlling the sexuality of one's women. Evolutionarily, Homo sapiens are, by these neurological structures, deeply captive to the limbic demands of honor and shame, of mimetic desire, and so on. Even the rare matriarchy is built on the foundation of limbic captivity, the two sides of the coin reading love of honor and fear of shame. The challenge to this tribal mentalité has only very recently come to dominance in the form of individual rights-based democratic policies, most commonly, currently successful ones we call democracies. This paradigmatic challenge, initially a rational one during the Enlightenment, argues that we should empathize with and try and respect the other rather than treat them as enemies, avoid violence, and seek positive-sum relations over zero-sum ones. All current scholarship about society and human relations, starting with Adam Smith and the birth of economics, is based on this notion that the rational mindset is the fundamental human mindset of the vast majority of the population. The very term political science itself, a stunning oxymoron, which should always be written with scare quotes, attests to the inability of scholars to think in terms of honor-shame with its volatile emotional variables that cannot be easily quantified. Since the end of the Second 30 Years' War, that is 1914 to 1945, that rational paradigm has come to dominate most of the most productive global discourse. The UN, the Geneva Accords, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are the new Westphalia, the new dispensation that takes its renunciation of honor-shame drives as a normative condition for progressive societies. That is, for those working for global civil society. And with increasing speed in the last third of the 20th century, that is the late 60s to the end of the 20th century, that progressive positive-sum paradigm has become at once more hegemonic, but least in the West, and more emotionally intense, where the Enlightenment's rationalists spoke about respecting the other, and the French Revolution's universal rights of man and the citizen defined liberty as doing anything which does not harm others. Postmodern and post-colonial paradigms are based on the deconstruction of the self and the embrace of the other, a far more radical, indeed I would call it messianic or millennial, approach. This progressive paradigm is so insisted on the new positive-sum norms that our scholars who study human behavior tend to ignore or deny the pull of honor-shame imperatives. Thus, in common parlance today, the expression senseless violence is something of a tautology. All violence is senseless, particularly in a culture committed to peaceful relations. And yet, in honor-shame cultures where one becomes a man by killing another, senseless violence is an oxymoron. All violence is meaningful. One saw, incidentally, the clash of cultures at work in Western leaders, even as in Western leaders bemoaning, and I'm thinking here specifically of President Obama and Secretary of State Kerry, bemoaning the senseless violence of the jihadi attack on Charlie Hebdo, even as everyone, including the members of PEN who opposed giving Charlie Hebdo the award, understood perfectly what that violence meant. It was not senseless violence, it was highly directed and meaningful violence, and what it meant was, do not provoke jihadis. The renunciation of the tribal us-them and the embrace of the other that came to dominate post-60s America and the West led to a peculiar dilemma for Western scholars. In the aftermath of the war, that is World War II, in the period where Western scholars wanted to contribute to the democratization and enrichment of the Third World, Think here of Eugene Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth. It became common to contrast honor-shame cultures with guilt-based cultures. But with the intensification of concern for the other, it became somewhat awkward to focus on honor-shame culture, since it implicitly, if not explicitly, created an invidious comparison between modern Western productive cultures and more primitive cultures, where both poverty and violence were part of the fabric of social life. As a medievalist, I study societies in which poverty and violence are part of the fabric of social life. There was would be funny if it didn't actually happen, incident recently at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where a professor wrote a piece defending bourgeois values, and half of the law school signed a petition denouncing her for hate speech by claiming that these values were, at least in the context of free and productive societies, superior to the values of other cultures. So this has become, in a sense, it's not just a question of, it's not nice, it's actually considered serious aggression. Already by the 70s, it became increasingly frowned upon to use the too facile, too invidious, too triumphalist approach that spoke of other cultures as driven by honor-shame. And Edward Said jumped on this bandwagon with both feet. He branded any honor-shame analysis that put Arabs in a bad light as racist and imperialist, two traits the West wished deeply to put behind itself, and two traits that greatly excited the dream palaces of the Arab world. Said so successfully associated honor-shame analysis with racism that he literally made it shameful for Westerners to even speak of it. Ironically, this profoundly cultural analysis, honor-shame is nothing if it's not cultural, got branded and banished as genetic, as a racist analysis. The result was a generation of Western scholars, limbic captives to the fear of being shamed as racists, and beginning in 1979 as Islamophobes, of being ostracized, fear of being ostracized from good company, from being deprived of venues for publication and lecturing and promotion and public conversation. In other words, all the things that make our lives honorable. This led to a bizarre and dangerous oxymoron. On the one hand, the profound disapproval of honor-shame, testosterone-based violence, of tribal us-them prejudices and hateful attitudes towards the other, which we denounce as racism, so permeates the progressive public sphere that any form of tribalism and solidarity gets condemned as warmongering, right-wing thinking to be avoided at all costs by good progressives, as if somehow we progressives had succeeded in eliminating a 150,000-year-old mentality. As if any manifestation among people in progressive societies of honor-shame dynamics were necessarily bad. And yet, at the same time, curiously, the same progressives who, even as they violently condemned, in some cases, the slightest violations of their codes when attributable to the dominant Western culture, that is, whites and their privilege, somehow scrupulously avoided attributing tribal behavior to others, lest they appear, those who would use that language, might appear prejudiced or even be accused of racism. And here I'm going to quote Edward Said, "At all costs, the goal of orientalizing the Orient again and again is to be avoided." And one of the things I'm arguing is that literally looking at the Orient in terms of honor-shame dynamics is, in his language, orientalizing. Without the Orient, there would be scholars, critics, intellectuals, human beings for whom the racial, ethnic, and national distinctions were less important than the common enterprise in promoting human community. Okay, so he's invoking this ecumenical approach and saying we shouldn't be so mean-spirited as to look at another culture and say they don't necessarily share this wonderful approach. In other words, what Said was saying was, don't talk about ethnic, racial, or even national religious differences. What most Middle Easterners will say are very important cultural issues to them, although probably less on the nationalism once you leave the range of intellectuals. But note, there's the absence of religion in Said's list, an absence which he quickly filled. This list was published in 1978. 1979, we have the Iranian Revolution, and 1981, I believe, he publishes Covering Islam, in which he applies the paradigm of anti-Orientalizing in terms of honor shame to the subject of religion. In Said's 1994 afterword to a new edition of Orientalism, he brought the post-colonial imperative on what not to discuss in polite progressive society up to date by denouncing the growing Western focus on Islam as a cultural, virtually a cultural crime. This is quoting him. Both the electronic and print media have been awash with demeaning stereotypes that lump together Islam and terrorism, or Arabs and violence, or the Orient and tyranny. Such phenomena, Said insisted, were not part of the whole picture, and focusing on them demeans and dehumanizes lesser people. He didn't put that in quotes, but I think he meant to, and denies, suppresses, and distorts reality. In essence, Said enjoined his fellow non-Muslim scholars to ignore the very issues that their societies most needed to understand if they were to follow the developments of the coming century. Hence, the very factors now dominant in the Arab and Muslim political culture, religious zealotry, violence, terrorism, unbridled authoritarianism, and exploitation of the weak, especially of women, are not to be mentioned because doing so belittles Arabs and Muslims and hurts their feelings. And anyone callous enough to so blame the victim clearly had racist tendencies and deliberately or not aggravated the conflict. And I think that was the fate of Samuel Huntington. Said warned against Orientalism with its demeaning and dehumanizing of the other that ends up corrupting knowledge, denying, suppressing, distorting. But the sad irony is that by denying, suppressing, and distorting the role of honor-shame dynamics in Arab and Muslim cultures, our knowledge base has become radically unreliable, disoriented by its disorientalism. So to sum up, what do we have? The most powerful force of socialization for over 150,000 years, the dominant mentalité de longue durée of humanity, has been declared off limits for the analysis of Arab and Muslim countries, even as the slightest manifestations of that mentality among Westerners is loudly denounced. Can one possibly come up with a better recipe for self-induced stupidity? So my advice to young scholars runs as follows. Resist the limbic captivity of fear of accusations of racism and Islamophobia, and step boldly into a bracing world of looking at things as they are. William Blake said, "Damn braces, bless relaxes." And Nietzsche compared thinking to diving into an icy river and taking a particularly striking stone from the bottom. Brace yourselves and dive into the rich rivers of honor-shame analysis. Fear more denial, suppression, and distortion in your work than you fear the disapproval of your professors and colleagues. It has taken Western civilization, by my count, this is my own reading of the Middle Ages, a millennium of intense effort, pain, and suffering to forge a civilization based on positive sum freedom, with all its great material benefits. How many of you have relatives who have died recently of hunger? Well, for the vast majority of the people in the period that I study, that's an annual event. So its great material benefits. That civilization is currently under attack from an apocalyptic millennial movement that has deep roots in Arabic and Muslim culture and is currently doing extremely well in a cognitive war campaign against us. Indeed, it can and does bill itself as the strong horse. And our ability to resist it will depend primarily on our ability to understand what we face. Post-colonial Middle East studies represents a major victory for the enemies of civil society, a victory for those aiming not at the positive sum, to quote Said, common enterprise of promoting human community, but the zero-sum enterprise of dominion and subjection so characteristic of honor-shame warrior cultures. On you rests the burden of a generation. Can our integrity overcome our fear of shame? Can we successfully resist subjection? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Franck. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Asaf. So I'd like to take a sort of a philological approach to this question and try to perhaps analyze language, the language that we use to look at and try to understand the Middle East. And my basic argument is that our failures when it comes to things Middle East, failures of understanding, failures of analysis, failures of policy, which emerges out of failures of understanding and analysis, have at their basis failures of language and the sort of expressions that we use in reference to the Middle East. I'll illustrate in a little bit, but essentially, you know, when we talk about the Middle East, the Muslim world, and use terms like the Arab world and the Muslim world and the Arabic language, we're conflating many different things here to mean only one thing. So we look at the Middle East as this monolith of Arab peoples or Muslim peoples, and we don't, you know, try to understand or define what we mean by Arab peoples. The term itself, Arab, is a fairly recent one. I'm not saying that, you know, Arab peoples are a recent invention, but the reference to this group of people as Arabs is a fairly recent development. It does not date back to any time before the early 20th century. Even the people to whom we refer to today as Arabs did not recognize themselves as Arabs prior to the 20th century. I would argue also that the group of languages that we refer to as the Arabic, one Arabic language, is one, not a single language. It's as if you were to say Indo-European is a language. I mean, Indo-European is a family of languages that has many branches that, you know, spans Iran to Ireland. So that term itself, Arab world, Arabic language, in my opinion, leads to misunderstanding the term Arab and what its ancillaries, Arabic language, Arab world, leads to the failures of understanding. And from that, a whole bunch of events that happened early on in the 20th century, the Great Arab Revolt, for instance, which is viewed by many Western scholars today as the beginning of the Arab peoples revolting against the Ottoman Empire, when it was in reality a Muslim revolt by a minor Muslim leader in what is today Saudi Arabia, revolting against the rule of the Ottomans. So what do we mean by the term Arab or Arab world? Bernard Lewis famously said, ethnic terms by their very definition are very difficult to define. And Arab is certainly not among the easiest. If the identifying factor in defining a person or a people as Arab is if the basic factor is language, meaning that if a person uses the Arabic language, therefore that person is an Arab. So what does that make a Christian from Lebanon or a Christian from Egypt? Does that make them an Arab? Arabs. What does that make an Arabic-speaking Jew? So this is a can of worms that scholars of the modern Middle East don't like to deal with, and they, for the sake of oversimplification, they sort of foist that term Arab on upwards of 300 million people who, before the 20th century, did not know they were Arabs. After the 20th century, continue to have a problematic relationship with the term Arab, with the people whom we refer to as Arabs, and with the Arabic language, whether or not they speak Arabic. So there are tens of millions of Middle Easterners today that we, without missing a beat, we refer to as Arabs, who really would take great umbrage at being referred to by those terms. So this is one caution I would like to begin with. And that hasn't been the case, really. Scholars prior to the 20th century brought a great deal of discipline to their taxonomy, to the way they referred. They had a profound understanding of the Middle East, the peoples of the Middle East, the diversities in language, ethnicities, religions, etc., that we tend to sort of brush aside for the purpose of oversimplification. I'll read you a couple of examples. Late 19th century French anarchist geographer and philosopher Élisée Reclus wrote in his description of Syria, and making sure his reader understood that Syria is a Western term, not a Syrian term, and it refers to a Western concept, not an Arab concept. And he used the term Syria and Syrians to differentiate between what Europeans themselves refer to as Arabs. So the Syrians were from a European conception. And by the way, the term Syria did not enter the Arabic lexicon until late in the 19th century, and it was by way of Europeans who referred to that piece of territory as Syria. From my part of the world, New England, the term Syria means exactly that. It means New England. It's a geographic terminology. It comprises Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, the states of New England. So it's not an ethnic term. It's not a national term. So Élisée Reclus wrote, the population of Syria and Palestine alleged to be Arab by some scarcely warrant this appellation, a designation justified only by way of an abusive labeling of spoken dialects as Arabic. Otherwise, these populations issue from the ancient inhabitants of the region, and the conquerors erupting from Arabia were never able to stamp out the indigenous cultures of the Levant. Indeed, the Levantines were left to their own devices, to their fields, to their homes, with the Arabs only demanding tribute. And you know, in the context of 19th century Europe, oftentimes the term Arab and Muslim were used to mean the same thing. Turk likewise, and this comes from the Europeans' perhaps inability of, this is in the 19th century post-French Revolution, referring to people by way of their religions. So when they used the term Arab, they meant more often Muslim. When they used the word, at least in French, when the French use the word Turk, they mean usually an Ottoman, but a Muslim Ottoman. For other peoples of the Ottoman Empire, they had different appellations for them, especially for the Christians and the Jews. So indeed, the Levantines were left to their own devices, to their fields, to their homes, with the Arabs only demanding tribute. The majority of Syrians might have, at times, converted to the Muslim faith, but they did so to the same extent that they might have converted to Christianity in earlier times from Judaism and paganism under the Byzantine Empire. But their conversion to the religion of Muhammad was hardly more heartfelt or deeper than their previous switch from paganism to Christianity a few centuries earlier. Now, on this point, more recently, the Brill Encyclopedia of Language and Linguistics notes that Before the movement of Arabs out of Arabia and across the Levant, Mesopotamia, and North Africa, the area now generically called the Arab world had hosted many other cultures, including Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The legacies of these pre-Arab, pre-Islamic peoples and cultures did not all simply disappear with the advent of Muslim Arabs. Some peoples of the region resisted the forces of Arabization, Islamization, or both. Even among those who underwent both these processes, this was not always accomplished by a total abandonment of their earlier culture. Thus, there are still people across the presumptive Arab world today using languages other than Arabic and practicing religions other than Islam, and there are still groups convinced that their ancestors belonged to a people different from those of their Arab and Muslim neighbors, end quote. And this incidentally applies also to such terms as Palestinian, Syrian, Iraqi, which all mean Arab, but in reality are not. I'll give you a simple example from 1939. 1939, there was a major World's Fair in New York, the New York World's Fair. And to sort of give you an idea what a World's Fair meant in the early 20th century, it was something comparable to the Olympic Games today. It was a time for peoples, nations, countries to really showcase their greatness, both those participating and the host country, by building, monumental architectural pavilions. None of the countries that we refer to today as the countries of the Arab world or Arab countries participated in 1939 because most of them were still under European control, European colonialism, British, French mandate. So those who participated, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, participated under Syria, Iraq, participated under the pavilion of the French colonial pavilion and the British colonial pavilion. Only two countries in the Eastern Mediterranean had their own pavilions, even though they were not sovereign independent states at the time. Lebanon was one. It represented itself under its own Lebanese pavilion, even though it was still under French mandate. And the other country, which was not yet a country, was still British mandate Palestine, was the pavilion of Jewish Palestine, 1939. So this is to tell you that there was a distinction being made. The term Palestinian meant something at the time. It meant the British mandate Palestine, and under this term, Palestinian meant a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Druze. It did not mean an Arab. And that's why the representation of this pavilion was specifically the Jewish Palestinian. So everybody was Palestinian under the French mandate. But you read today's, and these are the foundational courses that we teach in Middle East Studies. These are the books that students have to read in order the formation of the modern Middle East. Those authors who are otherwise very perspicacious historians who pay a great deal of attention to words when they read history, for some reason they don't choose their words right. So they speak, we're talking about the 1920s, British mandate Palestine, and those same authors speak of Zionists, assuming their readers know who the Zionists are. So we know that the Zionists are the Jews who are colonizing Palestine, and they speak of Palestinians tautologically to mean Arabs. And very little in terms of the literature of the time, Arabic literature emerging from British mandate Palestine and neighboring Beirut and Damascus, spoke in those terms, spoke of Palestinians to mean specifically Arabs. So this is something I think that is worth paying attention to. And this applies, incidentally, to today's fragmenting Syria. It applies to today's fragmenting Iraq. It applies to the whole of the states of the modern Middle East, which also in the normative literature about the Middle East, we talk about as those states that were the Arab world that was carved out by the British and the French at the end of World War I. So the Arab world that was carved out by the British and the French. So you see the problem that I see here in terminology such as this, carving out the Arab world. Carving out presumes that there was a united, unified, coherent, cohesive whole before these people came and began carving out. Carving out the Arab world also presumes that there was an Arab world before the British and the French messed it up. That is not the case, again. And I'll read you a couple of quotes and conclude. In her definition of description of Syria in the late 19th century, around 1872, 1875, Isabel Burton, a traveler and a wife of famed British explorer Sir Richard Francis Burton, summed up the ethnic enigma of the state of Damascus. This is not the country of Syria that we're talking about, but specifically the state of Damascus, which eventually, parts of which became what is today the modern rending Republic of Syria. She described it as an entity with various groups living together more or less and practicing their conflicting worship in close proximity. But in their hearts, the inhabitants of the state of Damascus hate one another. The Sunnites, this is her language at the time, 19th century, the Sunnites excommunicate the Shias, and both hate the Druze. All detest the Ansariye, who are the Alawites. The Maronites do not love anybody but themselves. I can see why. And are duly abhorred by all. The Greek Orthodox dominate the Greek Catholics and the Latins. All despise the Jews. End quote. Another observer of the time, a very strong proponent of Arab nationalism, actually, and some argue the inventor of the notion of an Arab nation, wrote that Syria has been a corridor between sea and desert, joining Africa to Asia, Arabia, and Europe. It had been never a single entity. It had been a prize ring, a vassal of Anatolia, of Greece, of Rome, of Egypt, of Arabia, Persia, and Mesopotamia. When given a momentary independence by the weakness of its neighbors, it had fiercely resolved into discordant northern, southern, eastern, and western kingdoms, with the area at best of Yorkshire, that is, in its largest iteration, with an area at best of Yorkshire, at worst of Rutland. This is in its smallest iteration. For if Syria was by nature a vassal country, it was also by habit a country of tireless agitation and incessant revolt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. So just to add a little bit to feed off what both my colleagues said, and then obviously we're open up the floor to as many questions as you have. I think to the middle of the 20th century and the beginning of 1947, I think part of the other element that needs to be looked at here, even before Said, is also how policy making was also done here in the United States. And part of that impact had to do with the Arabization and the romanticy that was involved within how the CIA was framed and how it looked at the Arab world. Predominantly, a lot of this was structured and based of the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, predominantly Archie and Kermit Roosevelt, who worked for the CIA and were involved deeply in Iraq, and a lot of the information that was getting into CIA structure about dissecting the Arab world came from their narrative. Predominantly, the views that were cascaded into American intelligence agencies at the time were anti-Zionist and anti-communists, and with the idea of shaping that narrative. Kermit Roosevelt had a very significant impact on this, but Archie, who was a Middle East scholar and the chief station of Beirut, together with Miles Copeland, who was involved in intelligence in World War II, that was where the information was coming into the United States. The interesting part about that narrative was also, of course, the how it became sold within American society. And a lot of it was done through academia. Individuals like Virginia Gildersleeve and Dodge Baer, who were academics and were fervent anti-Zionists, got involved in shaping that identity. To that end, the Roosevelts also were able to trickle in significant amount of money in order to shape that identity in the United States. They formed groups that were known as the Committee of Justice and Peace in the Holy Land, a group otherwise known as the acronym as HELP. Another group was called and the body of that HELP group was predominantly quoting here. It was comprised of entirely pro-Arab, anti-Zionist elements that was operating in the agency to serve as a publicity front for the operating agencies. Other groups that got involved were the American Council on Judaism, rabbis like Elmer Berger, who were also shaping that identity. So there was a composition of theologians, writers, Arab American educators and professors who were all taking on this narrative in order to put that into the conversation. And funded, of course, by CIA money this was the state of purpose to make this the understanding. Above all, was a leading nonprofit group that was called the American Friends of the Middle East, which again, to quote their mandate, it was a leading nonprofit organization engaged in international education, training and development of activities in the Middle East and North Africa. All of these NGOs were really the backbone of the understanding of how the Middle East should be shaped and looked at. So by the time you get to the period of time that Richard talks about as far as Said's understanding of the world, you already had enough sentiment within the intelligence agencies and within predominantly, which cascaded into the State Department later on, of this pro-Arab viewpoint that shaped the identity of a lot of the individuals who were teaching and talking about these issues. And then in the 1960s, as we start seeing a more heavily investment in academia, you start seeing a significant flows of money that are continuing to buy departments. These departments are particularly funded by Saudi money, with the idea that if one buys chairs and departments of these issues, one also buys the politics in which these departments teach and research these areas. Post-1967, there's a significant obsession and curiosity, depending on how you look at it, of the aftermath of the Six-Day War. To that end, there has been a clear flow of money that has gone to shape the viewpoint of looking and trying to dissect how one looks at these issues, how is it possible that the outcome of 67 came about in the way it did, but all of that built on the 1950s narrative that played into that conversation. So if you look at the field today, and to Franck's really important observations of the use of the language and the knowledge of the issues, you also have a modern day phenomenon which has significantly impacted the humanities at large, but above all, I would say Middle East studies at large, is you have, of course, the adaptation of the boycott movement, the modern day BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which is this attempt to create that monolithic viewpoint that is a fallacious viewpoint, but exactly what Franck was dissecting before, to kind of look at the Middle East in this black and white narrative, and of course that there are victims and victimizers, and to make it within this understanding that in order to have the honor-shame mentality, to quote Richard, and those who are oppressed, there are only two clear conclusions one can make is, of course, that there's only one narrative, it's monolithic, and of course that in some way, shape, or form, the centrality of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic and Israelis and Jews are the worst in all of that and are cascading that narrative. And what it has done to the field, which I think is also quite significant, in particular since the 1960s, is the emergence of more scholar activists that have basically taken on, instead of the scholarship itself, is actually their activism that has allowed them to put aside actual looking at data information and actually looking at the kind of scholarship that Franck spoke about that was before the 20th century. And that has significantly tipped the understanding of how Middle East is really being taught today. Those are the modern day ramifications, but I think that it's clear and it is critical to understand where the seeds of these issues come from and how they've also shaped policymaking. For years, also, you look at where the policy of looking at the Middle East has come from. Academia has been the #1 go-to place to look at these issues, and many of the scholars who've shaped that identity have come with these clear viewpoints. We're here right near Georgetown. The Arab Center at Georgetown, individuals like John Esposito had significant impact on how the State Department has viewed the Middle East, his ties with Saudi Arabia. These are the kind of elements that have cascaded into academia with this monolithic perspective, which of course gives a myopic, let alone fallacious picture of what the Middle East is like. But I think that it is critical to really bring it back to actual looking at data, looking at information to actually get a bigger picture of what's going on, which is what many of us on this panel have been impacted directly or indirectly by the field as students, as professors of these areas, because of that skewed viewpoint. And so what it comes out is that because I would say the all-inclusive viewpoint has become quite much, even more so today, anti-Zionist and pro-Arab in many ways, shapes, or form. Other viewpoints are usually shoved under the carpet and has been deemed as one political view over another in order not to allow them to be transmitted and discussed within classroom settings, within academia. Furthermore, I would say that another phenomenon that I think is critical with the rise of the current modern day environment is, of course, the rise of identity politics that has replaced scholarship in many ways, shapes, or forms, where the identity of the individuals has shaped the way that they look at the Middle East, the way they look at the topics that they teach, without looking at actual facts and data. That identity has taken over overwhelmingly, and given the excuse why not to look at information based on one's own politics and how one looks at the region at large. Those are, I think, the significant conclusions that need to be looked at today, and I think that part of the raison d'etre of this great association has been to kind of shift and to look at a much more methodical way of what the region actually is and how it should be looked at, in contrast to how Middle East studies is being taught today. Of course, in a few weeks we will see here in Washington, MESA's annual meeting that will be happening on November 18th. There is no doubt that as a result of the environment that we are describing to you today, MESA will probably vote to support overwhelmingly as an association their support of the boycott movement at large. They've laid the groundwork to make that happen last year. And I think that the absence of actually looking at data, information, the individuals, the peoples, the language, the environment has become tipped in one-sided. And I think that's something that behooves us as scholars and students of the Middle East to start looking carefully about the kind of information we're getting as we're talking about it, as we're looking at it, and as we're researching this very rich region that requires a lot of knowledge. So on that note, I will end, and I will open up the floor to as many questions. Thank you very much.
I'd like to ask